I am definitely going to want you to be able to distinguish between classical conditioning and operant conditioning situations. So if it's classical conditioning, look for stimulus substitution. If it's operant conditioning, you look for the three-term contingency, SRS. So here's an example, and I want you to think about whether this is operant or classical conditioning. In the 70s, a researcher named Seligman was working with dogs in what is called a shuttle box. It's not my favorite kind of research study, but here's how it went. You have a shuttle box, which is basically a box that has a barrier in the middle, and the dog is placed on one side, a bell rings, and then 15 seconds later, a mild shock is presented to the dog's paws on the bottom of the shuttle box. And the dog can learn to escape the shock by jumping over the barrier to the safe side. However, trial 2, the shock is presented on the other side of the shuttle box, and the dog learns to jump over the barrier to the first side, which is now safe. At any rate, we have a situation where there's a bell sound followed 15 seconds later by a mild electric shock. And the dog first learns to escape the shock by jumping the barrier into the other side of the shuttle box. And later, the animal will learn to never be shocked again because the bell rings and the dog jumps the barrier and in that case avoids the shock. Now, Seligman conducted these studies because he was studying learned helplessness. Basically, the animals were harnessed into one side of the shuttle box, and they went through this procedure without actually being able to jump over the barrier. And he said ultimately that he thought that the animals had learned helplessness, and he found that the way to get the dogs to ultimately learn how to jump the barrier, overcome the learned helplessness, was to physically assist them over the barrier. And Seligman, in the early part of his career, thought that learned helplessness was something that might occur in human depression. But for our purposes, just think about the procedure. Bell sound, 15 seconds later, a mild shock. The animal learns to jump the barrier, thereby escaping and ultimately avoiding the shock. Think about whether this is classical conditioning or operant conditioning. And if you think it's operant conditioning, I'd say you're correct, because we can think of this as negative reinforcement. The bell sound is the discriminative stimulus in the three-term contingency. The jumping over the barrier is the response, and by jumping over the barrier, shock is removed. And the likelihood of the animal jumping over the barrier in the future is going to increase. So this is reinforcement. So SRS, the three-term contingency, the bell is a discriminative stimulus, the response is jumping, and jumping removes the aversive stimulus. So this is negative reinforcement, and it is operant conditioning. But if you thought this was classical conditioning, I'd say you're correct as well. You can think of it this way. The shock is an unconditioned stimulus. It gives rise to physiological fear, shivering, whimpering, rapid heartbeat, without any kind of conditioning or training. So the shock is an unconditioned stimulus. Shock is a stimulus. It, without learning or conditioning, results in physiological fear. Now the shock is paired with the sound of a bell over and over again. And eventually the bell sound alone results in physiological fear in the absence of the shock. So the bell is a conditioned stimulus for physiological fear. So in real life situations, and I'm sorry I'm being a little tricky here, in real life situations you may have classical conditioning and operant conditioning occurring in the same situation. But on a quiz that I give you, I promise, I will make it so the question is worded so that you will know very clearly whether this is operant conditioning as the correct answer or classical conditioning as the correct answer. I have to be very careful about how I word it so that there will be no confusion. And I do want you to be able to tell the difference between the two situations.